You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing. Creator and host, Ken Vellante. Editor and producer, Peter Bauer.
This is Ken Vellante with the Something Rather Than Nothing podcast, and I have a great friend of mine and philosopher and thinker, Daniel Kern. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ken. It's great to be here. I'm excited.
Yeah, it was. I've been meaning to ask you on for quite some time. For the listeners, Dan and I know each other from time studying philosophy at Marquette University, and I just wanted to say right from the top, Dan's very influential as far as introducing me to science, something that he studied in the philosophy of science at Indiana University, and quantum mechanics, and looking at big, huge questions in philosophy and taking a look at the science and some of the amazing answers that are there, according, and also with his philosophy and theological training. So, Dan, I don't know if you remember some of those many conversations we had, and just talking philosophy and talking the big questions. I just wanted to express how much you helped me along and how much I still think of you in talking that philosophy.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I use quantum physics a lot in art. We have a philosophy club at my school, and I have a discussion of quantum physics that I go over every year with the philosophy club students. It's always fun.
Yeah, I think when you introduced me some of the concept in a way that I could understand and showing some things, it really gave me a new insight into different approaches to questions of causality in philosophy, of truth and knowledge. Not that I hadn't bumped into those, but as a way, as a deeper understanding and teaching. Just so listeners, Dan was born and raised in British Columbia. As I mentioned, got a master's of philosophy and science at Indiana University, master of divinity from Regent College, and a PhD in philosophy from Marquette University, as I mentioned, where Dan and I met. Dan, one thing I wanted to mention to you, I don't know if you know this, I've been a mentor for students at Marquette University for the last 8 or 9 years, and the alumni mentoring program at Marquette is recognized as the tops in the country, actually.
Wow, I didn't know either of those things. That's good to hear.
Yeah, it's been a unexpected and great experience to kind of help students, navigate what to do next, right? So it's been a nice time with that. So we're going to be talking to Dan about really the big question. Why is there something rather than nothing? But I wanted to just spend a little bit of time, Dan, I'll ask you to speak in just a bit, but I wanted to give the listeners a backdrop to Dan's book, A Reasonable Christian Faith. I just wanted to mention to Dan and to folks some pieces I found in going through this work. I really, and how I felt it was different from other books as well, is one piece, Dan, I really loved the practical approach, kind of pragmatism and kind of a working out of solutions within the work. I felt through my contact with it, thinking about American pragmatism, William James, it's just, there's always been something endearing to me about practical solutions or practical answers to problems. In writing the book, how much did your approach take from that? Kind of taking a look at complicated problems and saying, how do we sort this out, and how do we find truth and meaning in this? Did you approach this in a very pragmatic, practical way, your work?
Well, the section that I called Applications of a Reasonable Christian Faith was definitely a pragmatic approach, trying to say, if we look at this one particular problem, how would the things I say about Christianity, looking at what Jesus said and did, how would they apply to this one particular problem? So that was a very practical focus there.
one of the things in the book that I wanted to ask you about is one of the points in the that you make early on in the consideration of God that surprised me. And I'm away from the academy, and I don't always deal with these deeper questions. But in your reading, that the God must be worthy of worship. That reading that, it made a lot of sense to me, but I hadn't really read that as part of your approach. Could you talk a little bit more about that statement that the God must be a God must be worthy of worship?
Yeah, that was kind of, I think, a new idea for me too. It kind of came to me in the writing of the book, and it traces back to Aristotle primarily, who said that when people make decisions about what to do, ultimately their objective ultimately is to be happy. And so I was when I had established that there must be a God, at least reasonably must be. Um, I was thinking about the characteristics this God must have, and if God created people and people's ultimate objective is to be happy, whatever they do, then it would follow reasonably that God made people with that desire or that motivation, and so that one would think that God would have provided a way to um, satisfy that desire. So I say in the book, it's not necessary that maybe God just likes to frustrate people and punish them and stuff. But if there were such a God, since we do everything in order to be happy, we couldn't really worship that God, because worshiping that God would be leading us away from happiness. So since we do everything we do in order to become more happy, then if God is worthy of worship, then God must be leading us toward more happiness or more satisfaction or something like that.
Yeah, I really I really I was surprised in the book in a few different ways. That was one place that I was, and it was very fertile for me to think about. The other piece was, which I really got into your analysis again, which I wasn't really familiar with or hadn't read an exposition, which was Jesus's actions within the historical context that they occurred. You spend time within the work again with things that feel like of trying to show the shock or the radical nature of what Jesus was talking about. And I knew that theoretically in my head that yes, this was a big shift. I understand that. But what I hadn't experienced was kind of reading more close readings in understanding the true nature or the true shock of the preaching or the moral system there. Um, so I thought that was very successful in reaching me and me to have a deeper understanding of that. Is that? And I'm asking this as in a very naive way. Is that an area that's been of a decent amount of focus? Whether it's linguistically or academically, or where did you come in contact with that? It was so helpful for me.
Yeah, that's a pretty common theme. The prodigal son story is my favorite story from the scripture, and it's because of how radical that father acted in that culture. Um, but there's a number of writers who talk about Jesus' parables and how his parables always take something that's normal and everyday and flip it on its head.
Okay.
There's actually a book that was written, probably 30 or 40 years ago now, called The Upside Down Kingdom. And the focus is there is how Jesus really flipped everything socially and culturally on its head with his teachings and his actions.
I started to think because as you know, I've read a good deal of Eastern philosophy. I was thinking about like Zen koans do, right? They trip you up. It's that riddle. It's that shock, and you're like,
Yeah,
this isn't
there's
supposed to happen. That's not supposed to be said. That's nonsensical. And
right. I ran across a book, at least somewhere along the way, that talked about Jesus and Buddhism and how they're similar in that way, that flipping of things on their head.
yeah, that's definitely something I want to I want to dig in more. Another piece, Dan, and I know you studied, as a philosopher, you can go deeper into language itself. Another point, which was very helpful for me, and I thought subtle, was your discussion about language and what language makes possible. The language that we use makes possible in certain limits to it, or different ways of expressing it. And I felt when you made that point and you were talking about that point in the book, it was very easy to connect some universals to that people could be talking about in different languages in different ways about the same thing. And one point that you made, it said, the existence of non-empirical or spiritual knowledge is accepted by followers of every major religion. And it was just a simple point that was just needed to be stated. But I was very intrigued by that, or where our skepticism shows up. And of course, you deal with, things of miracles. And I believe when I read how you wrote about them, it was like, there was this piece where it was like, there's a lot of unexplained things, folks. There's a lot. And we seem hung up on this. I thought that was very useful, reminder. Do you have to remind folks a lot about that a lot of the things that are the strongest beliefs might, be spiritual or other?
Well, that would be part of what I was doing in my book, I think, trying to remind people of that, because we've become such a rational, scientific community, the Western world at least, that there's very little space for anything other than empirical truth, I think, in our culture. So that was one of the ideas I had in the book, was trying to remind people that it's hard to establish non-empirical truth. I'm straightforward about that. And empirical truth is pretty easy to establish, but that doesn't mean there isn't any non-empirical truth. And so we have to be careful about that.
Yeah, I liked a lot of your analysis, kind of, taking apart, false dichotomies and getting out of some intellectual traps as far as ways of framing issues. All right, Deanne, I want to go back to the beginning of it all. The podcast is something rather than nothing. And as I've done it over time, I've stumbled around even how to ask the question, because I end up getting, should it be, how is there something rather than nothing? Some folks want to pose it that way, or the why. But one of the big reasons I brought you on, in connection to, your book, was to talk about the something rather than nothing question. And the reason why I ask you is because of your approach, because of your knowledge of other thought systems, and because of your scientific background, your study of the philosophy of science. So, how do we go about this question?
Well, my first response may be somewhat disappointing. I'm sorry, but I don't think we can answer why or how there is something rather than nothing. The philosophers I'm primarily interested in wonder about what, if there's any conclusions or any further stuff we can draw from the fact that there is something rather than nothing.
Right.
And there are some interesting discussions about what we can know about the world or the universe, or whatever word we use for it, given that there is something rather than nothing.
And with that framing, let's proceed.
All right. Well, I'd go all the way back to the ancient Greek philosopher Parmenides, and actually the modern philosopher John Locke. Both had similar arguments that, given that there is something now, it must be the case that there's always been something, because if there was ever a time when there was nothing, then nothing would ever come from it. So if there is something, then there must always have been something. There can't be a time when there isn't something. So that's a pretty remarkable conclusion to draw right there. And go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dan.
To go a little bit further, this argument's been carried all the way through Plato and Augustine and Aquinas and everyone, but the world that we experience in philosophy is called contingent. It means it can either exist or not. It doesn't have to exist. But if everything were always contingent, then there must have been some time in the past where nothing existed. But that can't be the case, as we've already established. So we can further establish that there's something that must be non-contingent. That means something that must exist in an absolute sense, that it's not possible for it not to exist. And that's what leads many philosophers to the idea of there being a God outside of this world that created it.
Yeah. One of the pieces I wanted to ask you about, and of course you're close in particular about language, is one of the difficulties I've found sometimes in having the conversation, let's say, between a Buddhist or a Christian approach, can sometimes be around the terminology that, some of the analysis that you do within the book. So one of the difficulties, I think, for a general Western thinker is that the term, emptiness or nothingness or no inherent existence within Eastern context is, deemed to see as some sort of nihilism, and it's a reasonable conclusion. I mean, the way those terms are used, that there's no thing, where things are things real. And one of the things I found in studying Buddhism is that there's a reclamation of the nothing as a general realization of the way things are, that within the nothing, I hate to use this for shorthand, but there's something, that there is everything else. And the exercises and the philosophy in that tradition is all soteriological, in a sense. We're thinking about salvation through philosophy and through our thinking. Do you believe part of the issues, if we look at the question I try to ask and I based the show on in a strange type of way, is what nothing actually means? And is there some kind of ways to kind of cut through that?
Yeah, if I could just give you a couple of reflections that you made me think of. I think you and I studied Kant together and talked about Kant and Buddhism a few times.
We sure did,
and
yeah.
It's also similar with Taoism, I think. This idea that we carve the world up into language, and language is based on concepts which we have formed based on our experience of the world. But the question is, what if you go beyond that? What if you go beyond the language that we're using or the concept that we're using, and ask what's there? And in one sense, the answer is we can't know. But in another sense, the answer is nothing, because all the things that we think are already conceptualized and put into language by us. So if you could see reality unconceptualized or unlinguistically, it must seem like nothing. It must be some connection to nothing, because something is always a perception that we have.
Yeah. You had another point that you said, a couple of reflections. I didn't want to cut you off.
Oh, I think it was Kant and Taoism were the two things I was bringing together there.
Yeah, well, and I remember, because around the same time of studying Kant, and of course I'm thinking about noumenal and phenomenal, these kind of ways of describing reality, the easiest way to describe it. And then within Buddhism, there were even analogies in the way that you talked about things. It was kind of like you would have a Buddhist practitioner saying, yeah, like, I know the thing is like really there, you can touch it and all this stuff, but there's no inherent existence behind it, and don't get attached to it, because the further your attachment, the further you're suffering. So it's like kind of like super practical about it, or realize that all these somethings kind of unlayer them or what's doing them, which is I don't know, it feels like what philosophy does. Um, one of the other questions I had, or one of the observations, and I just wanted to give me a little bit of feedback. I appreciated in your analysis other philosophers and other traditions, including Averroes. There's a 12th century Islamic philosopher, and studying the covering Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas. But your use of Taoism and other traditions seem to be very much kind of what I would call within Buddhism, kind of like skillful means of using devices and ways of showing the same reality. Do you find, did you use that deliberately as kind of like a way to kind of just approach maybe the same thing from a different angle? I appreciated the different ways of that you approached the question.
I think so. I think I was trying to show there that these same problems have been answered by people in different cultures and different religions very, very similarly. So I wanted to bring in a non-Western, non-Christian thinker to show that these ideas have been around not just in the Western world, but in the more Eastern religions as well.
I wanted to ask you, as a professor, Dan, you've taught for quite some time. Is it proper pronunciation Chaffey College?
Chaffey, yes.
Yeah, Chaffey College.
Mm-hmm.
And do you find differences in interest in philosophy over your time with students coming in? Or is it feel the same? I ask this question in art sometimes, like, what is the role of art? Is it different now? And but I was just wondering, with regards to why somebody might study philosophy. It's 2023 now. Do you see something different?
No, the way I see it is there are certain students whom philosophy just seems to take hold of, and it's never predictable, and you're never quite sure. And a lot of students come into my classes and say, I didn't even know what philosophy was, but having had this class and started reading philosophy, I find that I love it, and I can't get away from these questions and these problems. So in that term, in that sense, I think philosophy is really a universal kind of thing, and it has this way of just capturing certain people and drawing them into itself. And I find that's very similar over the whole time that I've been teaching and learning.
Yeah, I've been, like I said, I've been away from the academy a bit, and it's a place where I spent quite some time, and I was able to teach at the University of Rhode Island and teach philosophy. So I've found many blessings over time to come back in contact with the university and college. And I've always been close to colleges and universities in places where I lived. I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, of course, and out in Milwaukee. And of course, being from the East Coast, a lot of colleges and universities out that way. I just want to say, Dan, it's always great to when I think, and because I think about you often and thinking about you teaching down that way.
Thanks.
I know those students get a lot from you. Dan, I wanted to take the conversation on a little bit of a different angle. This is an art and philosophy podcast, and I just wanted to see musings from you and about that question. What is art?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that since we've been talking about this, and I'm not an art philosopher by any means, but I'll give you my general responses. the philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote a book called The View from Nowhere. And in this book, he was talking about the view from in science and rationality to try to view the world, see what the world would look like from without any perspective. And he said that that's impossible. You can't. It's impossible to step outside of your own perspective to view the world. Um, so, as an aside, that's really what Kant said. I think too. I think all these problems trace back to Kant. That Kant said as we were just talking, your concepts and your language that you are a way to view the world. And also, as an aside, I almost thought about making as a subtitle of my book, "The View from Somewhere," just to use Kant's idea. But I didn't
Love
think
that.
anyone would know what I meant by that. So,
Oh, I would have loved it. I might not have known, but yeah, I would have loved it.
all right. The other thing is, I just heard an NPR episode today about it's about a documentary called "The Art of Grief," and it's about a guy who's lost someone, maybe his father, and did a lot of processing of the grief through art, through drawing and painting. And he's reflecting on how his drawing and painting and stuff was different during his period of grieving than it was otherwise. And then they talked to an art therapist, and the art therapist said art is a way to get beyond language and to address and express ideas and perspectives that can't be captured linguistically. So I thought that was a good analogy or a good explanation of art in general. It's people who can somehow step outside of language and use a different medium to express their perspective. Right? They have a unique perspective on the world, and they're expressing that perspective without language, without traditional rational concepts, but with a different medium. And so that really all struck me and kind of came together as a way of looking at art. I now find quite as a helpful way.
That's that. I was responding to what you had to say. It was just very powerful. And no, I appreciate you mentioning the art of grief. I remember encountering, I believe the name of the artist was Preston Zeller. I haven't seen that film yet, but I was very intrigued because one of the things in this podcast that I've gotten into was what art processes for us. And I think when you talk about your definition of art, of what is art, it's about how do we speak? How do we speak and communicate about things in other ways? That's why I found that to be powerful. So I do have to watch that film, and you found it to be quite the film, didn't you?
Yeah, I haven't seen the film. I just heard the discussion about it on NPR
On
today.
NPR, yeah.
It sounds. I want to see it when it comes out. It sounds very good.
Well, we'll make a point to both watch it. I believe it's available on Amazon. Hey, Dan, I wanted to make sure that the listeners to the podcast have the opportunity to read some more about things that you've written or what you'd like to share about philosophy or ways to contact you and things like that.
Uh, sure. The book is published on Whitfinstock and can be found on their website, whitfinstock.com. It's also accessible through Amazon as everything, and Barnes and Noble as everything is nowadays. I'm not sure. I guess you could contact me at kerndan1@yahoo.com, KERNDAN1@yahoo.com. That's an email you can use to contact me if you want.
Hey, Dan, thanks so much for coming on to the podcast. It's actually, as you know, it's a great pleasure to see you and to chat with you. And uh, hearing your voice in your book, particularly one that taught me a lot, and not just in books, but taught me a lot. That's what writing can do. That's what communication can do. I just wanted to let you know. I really appreciate you and coming onto the show and writing and teaching the way that you do.
Well, thank you for the kind words about my book. That's why I wrote it. So I really appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, and I felt that I felt it reflected a lot of conversations we've had that helped me uh, be more compassionate, more open, more understanding. And I think the nub of it for me, Dan, is about how we treat each other, no matter where we're polarized or things around that. How do we interact and honor each other or love? The love, the tension you pay on that word in this book, love, as a centering concept. I'll go with that one.
Yeah.
I'll go with that one. So
Yeah. I tried to work that into the definition or idea of love that Jesus talks about is wanting and pursuing the good of the other, not just our own good. One place I said you have to think about the good of the other and make sure you understand what is the good for the other. Otherwise, you're claiming to want the good of the other is kind of hollow.
and it feels and sounds like like another radical inflection just of how you think about it, how you think about love. So um Dan, great to see you. Thanks for coming on to Something Rather Than Nothing, and helping me frame this question I've been trying to get at from a million different directions. But great to see you, and thanks from the bottom of my heart.
Thanks, Ken. It's been a pleasure. Hope to do it again sometime.
Take care.
Take care.
This is Something Rather Than Nothing.